بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا وإمامنا محمد بن عبد الله عليه من ربه أفضل الصلاة والتسليم أما بعد. In the first lesson we briefly mentioned the reality that ilm mustalah al-hadith, the science of hadith terminology, has its background in the Quran and is in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and many statements, narrations from the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum, may Allah be pleased with them, the companions, and the Salaf Salih, the pious predecessors. And that is not a new thing, rather it was established. The general principles and the general rules are mentioned in the Quran, in the Sunnah, and in the statements and the actions of the Sahaba and of the Tabi'een. And the author, may Allah reward him well, Dr. Tahan, he mentioned a proof and an example for each of the three. He then goes on to say, وبناء على أن الخبر لا يقبل إلا بعد معرفة سنده فقد ظهر علم الجرح والتعديل والكلام على الرواه ومعرفة المتصل أو المنقطع من الأسانيد ومعرفة العلل الخفية وظهر الكلام في بعض الرواة لكن على لقلة الرواة المجروحين في أول الأمر. Dr. Tarhan, he says, and based off of what we've just mentioned, or based off of the fact that a khabar, a narration, to make things easy, you can say a hadith cannot be accepted unless we know of its isnad. We cannot accept a hadith unless we know of its chain of narration. If someone comes and they tell you a story, where did they get that story from? Did they see it directly? Did they hear it themselves? Or did they get it from another person who possibly got it from another person, so on and so forth? The chain of reporters. So due to the fact that we cannot accept a khabar, a narration, unless we have isnad, then the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil came into existence. Because if we have a story, if we have a narration, we have a chain of reporters, we have to know the condition of those reporters. Are they pious, religious reporters? Are they Muslims or non-Muslims? Were they of age? Did they have sanity? What was their level of memory? Did they have a precise retentive memory, or were they weak and poor in their memorization? Were they sinners? So on and so forth. We have to know what is their grade, and that is from the most important aspects of the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil, is looking into the narrators. So he says, based off of that, there became the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil. They begin to look, they begin to investigate, they begin to criticize and to critique the narrators and the reporters. For example, this man is a hafiz. He has a perfect memory. And this one is sayy al-hifz. He has a poor memory. This man is a saduq. He's a good, reliable person who tells the truth. He doesn't have the best memory, but he's truthful. And this one is a kadhab. He's a liar. And so on and so forth. He's a mubtadi'. He's an innovator. He's a da'iyah. He's a caller to innovations. So on and so forth. This is the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil. He says, and speaking about the reporters, and knowing the chains of narrations which were continuous, which remained connected link after link, and those chains of narrations were broken or discontinued. We had to know, did Fulan meet Alan? Did narrator A meet and hear from Sheikh B? So on and so forth, in order for the chain to connect. So due to these realities, this is when the science of hadith terminology came into play. He says, and knowing the hidden defects of the hadith, the glitches which were subtle, which didn't seem so apparent, and the person had to take a second look, more investigation to find out that something is wrong with this chain of narration. He says, and speaking about the reporters once again, he says, lakin ala qilla, but it was just in a few instances. Okay, that's because there were only a few narrators during the earlier generations of the Muslims who were considered to be majruh, those who were disparaged and were criticized. During the time of the Tabi'een, the Kibar Tabi'een, there weren't too many outward liars. There weren't too many habitual liars during that time, just a few people. There weren't but so many mubtadi'ah, so many innovators, and people who practiced bid'ah. Okay, there weren't too many people who were outward with doing major sins and so on and so forth. Rather, the narration itself was simple and small. The Muslims, they lived in their countries, their respective communities, and the major Islamic conquest didn't spread. to the different countries where it was so many vast lands, and one hadith could have 4 or 5 different narrators in the chain, or 6 people. It was the companion to the Prophet ﷺ. It was one companion from another companion from the Rasul ﷺ. A big tabi'i from Abu Hurairah from the Rasul ﷺ. وهكذا. So he's saying that in the beginning, there wasn't too much of a need for this science. So that's why we don't find books that are that old, going back to the early generations, speaking about the science of hadith terminology and the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil, which bi-idhnillahi azza wa jal, we will speak about in a separate series of lessons. The author, he says, ثم توسع العلماء في ذلك حتى ظهر البحث في علوم كثيرة تتعلق بالحديث من ناحية ضبطه وكيفية تحمله وأدائه ومعرفة ناسخه من منسوخه وغريبه وغير ذلك إلا أن ذلك كان يتناقله العلماء شفويا. He says, then afterwards, in the later generations, the scholars begin to go into extensive research with regards to these subsidiary branches and these side subjects and topics of hadith science. The scholars begin to speak about the dhabt of hadith. Is the hadith with a fatha or with a kasra? Is it a sin or is it a sheen in this person's name? Is his name Bashar or Yasar? It is with a ya or ba. Is a ta, mu'jama, muhmala, so on and so forth. Is it mudaf ilay or is it marfu', so on and so forth. For example, a person can say the katul janeen, the kat ummihi, and so on and so forth. The difference of opinion with regards to the dhabt of the hadith, precisely narrating what the hadith says or the person's name, because there can be a difference between Bushair and Bashir. It can be 2 different individuals, but they're both written the same way. And these examples will have to be explained in another time and another place. He says, وَكَيْفِيَةِ تَحَمُّلِهِ وَأَدَائِهِ, how to receive a hadith and how to narrate them. What were the etiquettes of the student of hadith? How to sit down, how to seek hadith, who to listen to, who to listen from, who to write down hadith from, who to stay away from. How do you present a hadith? How old do you have to be? So on and so forth. He says, and knowing the hadith which were nasikha and mansukha, the hadith that presented rulings that were cancelled, that were abrogated. In the beginning of Islam, the people couldn't drink out of specific vessels. They couldn't drink out of specific vessels. And then later on, the Prophet ﷺ allowed them to drink out of all vessels as long as it wasn't an intoxicant. The people were not allowed to go to visit the graves. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed them to visit the graves, and he told them to visit the graves, and so on and so forth. He says, and knowing the gharib, the rich vocabulary of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. What does this word mean? When the Muslim conquest spread and the Arabs, or the people who spoke the pure Arabic language, mixed with non-Arabs, and they became quote-unquote slang or colloquial Arabic, and so on and so forth, the Arabic tongue amongst the general mass became weak, and there were words that were very rich words that were mentioned in the hadith that many people didn't know about. So the science was brought into play, explaining and expounding on those terms, and that has to be explained in another time. He says, but the only thing is that with all of these different sciences that the scholars began to speak about, and right, he says they were passed on by oral tradition. Things were not written down and recorded on a very large scale. There were documents, okay, there were memorandums. Things were recorded, but not on a large scale. Most of it was passed down by the oral tradition. The author, he says, ثم تطور الأمر وصارت هذه العلوم تكتب وتسجل لكن في أمكنة متفرقة من الكتب ممزوجة بغيرها من العلوم الأخرى كعلم الأصول وعلم الفقه وعلم الحديث مثل كتاب الرسالة وكتاب الأم للإمام الشافعي. He says, and then things evolved even more. And these sciences and these departments or branches of knowledge began to become written down. And they were actually recorded. He says, but once again, they were recorded in different places. They weren't just mentioned in all one book or one source. Science of hadith, jarh wa ta'dil, etiquettes of tahammul, of adab. They were spread out in different sources. He says some of this information could be found in the books of usul al-fiqh, legal theory. Some of these different types of sciences were found in the actual books of fiqh, or books of hadith, and so on and so forth. There was no one specific book at this time in the early generations that says hadith science, hadith terminology, hadith jarh wa ta'dil that survived and made it to our current day. He says in many books such as the Risala and such as the book of of Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. We know Imam al-Shafi'i, who died in the beginning of the 3rd century, 204 to be exact, according to what some scholars say. His 2 books, Al-Risala and Al were not specifically written for ilm al-hadith. They were more towards or geared towards the genre of usul al-fiqh, but it has several principles of hadith, hadith science, jarh wa ta'dil, so on and so forth, that were mentioned in those books of Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. وأخيرا لما نضجت العلوم واستقر الاصطلاح واستقل كل فن عن غيره، وذلك في القرن الرابع الهجري، أفرد العلماء علم المصطلح في كتاب مستقل، وكان من أول من أفرده بالتصنيف القاضي أبو محمد الحسن بن عبد الرحمن بن خلاد الرامهرمزي المتوفى سنة 360 للهجرة في كتابه المحدث الفاصل بين الراوي والواعي. وسأذكر أشهر المصنفات في علم المصطلح من حين إفراده بالتصنيف إلى يومنا هذا. He says, and then finally, when the sciences were totally developed, or they matured 100%, they became ripe, for lack of better words, and the terminology became separate and distinguished. There was a specific topic called ilm usul al-fiqh, ilm mustalah hadith, ilm al-jarh wa ta'dil, ilm al-ilal, ilm gharib al-hadith. Every science, every sub-branch got its own title. It had its own specific genre and classification. He says, and this happened in the 4th century of the Hijrah. The 4th century of the Hijrah, when the scholars started writing books that were specific and special to ilm al-mustalah, to hadith science and hadith terminology. The author says, from the very first of those scholars who did this was Al-Qadi Abu Muhammad Al-Hasan ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Khalad al-Ramahurmuzi. For short, a person can say Imam al-Ramahurmuzi, who died in the year 360 of the Hijrah. He was a great scholar who came from Persia. He wrote a book which was entitled Al-Muhaddith al-Fasil Bayn al-Rawi wal-Wa'i. This was the title of his book, Al-Muhaddith al-Fasil Bayn al-Rawi wal-Wa'i. In a rough translation, you could say the distinctive hadith scholar, or the distinct hadith traditionist, or between the narrator and the one who understands and comprehends. So a very rough translation. I know him, this was the name of his book. And the author, he says, there's going to come a time in which he's going to mention the most famous books of the science of mustalah in the next chapter. Now, before we stop, there were many scholars who wrote books on the science of hadith, even though they weren't separately written or authored on the science of hadith, way before Imam Abu Muhammad al-Ramahurmuzi. We said that he died in the year 360. If we look at Imam Ali ibn al-Madini, rahimahullah, the great friend of Imam Ahmad and the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari, the Imam of Baghdad, he had several books. And Imam Ali ibn al-Madini died before the first half of the 3rd century, approximately 233 of the Hijrah. 233 of the Hijrah, died before Imam Ahmad. Ali ibn al-Madini has several books on mostly all subjects of hadith science, but these books did not survive. These books didn't come, they weren't preserved, they were destroyed, they were lost, they were stolen. So this is why some people say that this man, Abu Muhammad al-Ramahurmuzi, Imam Abu al-Ramahurmuzi, who came in the year 360, he was first. Also, we have Imam Muslim, rahimahullah, who died in the year 261. In the beginning of his Sahih, the Muqaddimah of Sahih Muslim, the introduction of his Musnad Sahih, his Muqaddimah is full of principles, full of rules of hadith science, of al-jarh wa ta'dil, of preserving the sunnah, so on and so forth. However, it wasn't something that was mustaqil. It wasn't a separate book. It wasn't something that he wrote with a title pertaining to hadith terminology and hadith science. This is why they say that he was the first one, that he was the pioneer or the trailblazer for writing about hadith terminology. And he died in the year 360. It's a very important date. in the 4th century. But in reality, we say there were scholars who wrote about it before him, generations before he came, but their books either didn't survive and they didn't reach us, or they were parts of other books that had different topics, such as Imam Ash-Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala. We'll stop here, bi'idhnillahi azza wa jalla, and we ask him subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us beneficial knowledge and righteous action, and to make us true students of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, outwardly and inwardly. Wa sallallahu alaihi wa sallam wa barak ala abdihi rasuli nabi Muhammad wa jazakumullahu khairan.